Hello, I'm Troy Sangaron, Senior Director and Fellow here at the Korea Economic Institute. Governments around the world are increasingly focused on the issue of economic security. But in the case of South Korea, energy security and raw material security are a key component of any economic strategy. Korea is highly dependent on imports of both, as events in recent years have demonstrated. Geopolitics is also playing a significant role in the supply of these types of materials. We've seen this in the case of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, numerous disruptions in the Middle East to petroleum from various wars, as well as China now recently taking and putting in place export licenses for certain critical raw materials required for the construction of semiconductors and EV technology. To discuss these challenges and Korea's policy options, we are delighted to have James Bowen from the Perth U.S. Asia Center in Australia with us here today. James is a policy fellow at the Perth U.S. Asia Center and has published influential reports and analysis related to energy, critical minerals, climate change, and related resources and geoeconomic issues in Australia and in the Indo-Pacific. So I can hardly think of someone more qualified to talk about this topic today. James' remarks are based on a forthcoming paper here at KAI for the upcoming issue of KAI's journal Korea Policy. This current journal is focused on economic security in the Indo-Pacific. This paper explores the issue of energy security and critical mineral security for South Korea. On a similar note, we recently had the most recent issue of Korea Policy come out, defining the Indo-Pacific, a region of diverse visions. So I'd encourage you to either look for the articles online for this volume as well, or to get a hard copy here at KAI. The issue on economic security hopefully will come out before the end of this year, so that is forthcoming as well. Before turning the floor over to James, just a note for those watching online, we will be setting aside time at the end of the program for Q&A. If you have a question for James, please feel free to place it in the YouTube chat function. And with that, James, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thanks so much for the opportunity to write this paper and for bringing me out here to discuss it. I've really enjoyed the opportunity, enjoyed writing the paper. My work at Perth US Asia has had a very heavy South Korean focus in recent years. I think that's a function of Australia's very intense energy and resources linked relationship with South Korea. I really enjoyed digging into this subject of economic security as well. And so in the paper, I essentially start from the premise that economic security begins with resource security, and exploring that through the South Korean case study is very apt. I think that South Korea epitomizes that dynamic, that link between resources security and economic security. So I focus on two areas: energy security and critical mineral security. I think those are somewhat discrete, but they're increasingly interlinked areas, particularly because of the energy transition and the demands that places on critical minerals. So to some extent, critical minerals can be considered maybe a subset of energy security or an evolving subset of energy security. But there are a number of reasons that why we might still consider it discreetly. So I mainly, analyse the current Korean administration's approach in these areas, including the commitments under the strategy for the free, peaceful, and prosperous Indo-Pacific region. And I guess a bit of a spoiler alert: my central assessment is that Seoul, has necessarily adapted a lot of its policies to exigent circumstances, but as I get into later in the presentation and in the report, it might be putting off some harder choices, and I think maybe that's a familiar situation in terms of Korea's policies in this space. So I go into a lot of historical context in the paper, but I'm not really particularly going to go into that today, time limitations. But suffice to say, I think we know that Korea's economic model is very energy and minerals intensive. The manufacturing accounts for about quarter to 30% of GDP, has the highest industrial energy usage in the OECD, among the OECD countries, a lot of demand for minerals as well. And as you mentioned, incredible dependence on imports as well, so upwards of 95% in aggregate for minerals and energy, sometimes higher for certain materials. Fossil fuels are almost 100% basically as well, and fossil fuels make up a large part of Korea's energy mix. And that creates a lot of vulnerabilities, obviously. But generally, historically, Korea's been able to maintain that profile in spite of past disruptions, I think, like the oil shocks of the 1970s or the early 2000s commodities boom, which saw prices spiral upwards as well. And the Yoon administration has embraced this idea of economic security including in relation to resources, and that's something they focus on in the paper as well. So the Indo-Pacific Strategy sorry, I'll just go back a bit. I think, sorry, just lost my place for that. So one thing I think that has helped Korea in that respect in terms of being able to adapt is diversification previously of its resources mix. So using more gas and nuclear, I think particularly since the 1990s onwards. Another is adoption of policies that are often described as resource diplomacy. So that involves state-owned enterprises investing in overseas resource projects to seek priority access to resources outside the open market. And that was especially noticeable in response to that early 2000s commodities boom I mentioned. There was a lot of investment overseas as a result of that. But there's a bit of a mixed record, I think, in terms of delivering resource security through those projects. And there's been less enthusiasm for that process in more stable markets, stable environments. There tends to be criticism of the often poor returns on investments and public debt accumulation, even instances of corruption. So that's kind of fallen from favour in recent years. But I'd say that one thing that's definitely uncontroversially benefited Korea's resource security has been participating in and helping to sustain really globalised and integrated markets and dynamic markets for energy and minerals over the years. And those result from its own deliberate policy interventions and also other governments. And I think that they have a bit of a self-sustaining quality as well. So periods of high prices tend to develop new shock-absorbing mechanisms through deliberate interventions or just the price signals. So new supply comes online, diversification of energy mixes away from, or energy and resources mixes away from commodities that are problematic. But I think, in the current era, this rise of economic security shows that the forces of disruption we're currently experiencing have tested the Korean faith, and most governments' faith in those market forces as well, and in these globally integrated markets. So, governments like Seoul are seeking greater insulation from shocks like we saw under COVID-19 and the Russian war in Ukraine, particularly on the energy front. Many are also fighting back against what they see as perceived erosion of the liberal economic order. And as I mentioned, the Yoon administration has embraced this idea of economic security in the same way that other governments have, including in relation to its resources policy. So the Indo-Pacific strategy commits Korea to this is a quote, to expand regional economic security networks for stable and resilient supply chain management. And it also pledges to stabilise supply chains for strategic resources by cooperating with partners with whom we share values. So I think that's pretty familiar language to an American audience, and also a lot of other Indo-Pacific governments have adopted similar policies. But I think that the current administration also has a very strong preference for more laissez-faire economics as well, and that comes through in the Indo-Pacific strategy, and it's in contrast to the US, I would say, as well, particularly the new Washington consensus turn against free trade. So so President Yoon's speech to the World Economic Forum in January this year, he called free trade a global public good that can never be forsaken. And I think that you can contrast that to what we've heard from American leaders and other leaders in the region. It's a pretty strong defence of free trade still, even though responding to exigent circumstances, as I say, through economic security. So turning specifically to the energy security realm, the Russian war in Ukraine obviously had a massive effect on Korea's fuel import bill. That was the most immediate effect. It's also had more significant long-term effects on its perspectives on energy security. I think that one of the biggest impacts I've hinted at already is a renewed commitment to diversifying fossil fuel relationships with a strong preference for like-minded partners. But perhaps greater is diversifying away from imported fossil fuels in aggregate in general. So on the like-minded partner front, I think it's firstly important to state that Korea was probably already in a better position, better shape than it could have been because of interventions that had happened in the past decade or so leading up to Russia's war in Ukraine. So countries like the US and Australia had already risen to be more major energy providers, and you can certainly count those countries as like-minded, I think, over a period of a decade or more in oil and gas, and Australia is also a major coal provider to Korea as well. And that's significant for the fact that there have been these long-term plans or long-term intentions from Korean policymakers to see Russia as perhaps a vital source of diversification away from the Middle East. So there are a number of reasons why that didn't happen to the extent maybe that was envisaged, but the counterfactual, that Australia and US and other more trusted companies are more important energy partners rather than Russia is broadly beneficial, obviously. I think there's probably some policy levers that Seoul can pull to continue that process of diversification, and one of them might be that a revitalised focus on that resource diplomacy, investment in overseas projects, as I said. The current government has sought to enhance the abilities of state agencies and to support private industry in that endeavour. But I suppose that has to be balanced around the long time frames of projects and investments, has to be balanced around climate goals, decarbonisation as well. And an interesting thing I want to offer, a perspective I want to offer from Australia as well, that you need to, the Koreans perhaps have to take into account is what like-minded partners, what prospective like-minded partners are doing in this space as well. So, Australia is also responding to this period of intense disruption in energy markets with its own policies. So there has been a raft of impositions on fossil fuel developments in Australia in terms of getting windfall tax profits, controlling prices, so price caps, and also climate legislation that has potentially, maybe in the long term, disrupted or affected Australia's attractiveness as an investment destination, and there's potential even that there might be some diversion of short-term energy flows from Australia to its trading partners to the domestic market if it goes into shortfall. And that's really spooked Korean policymakers, Japanese policymakers, and a lot of others in the regions. Potentially that's something that might spread to the US as well if there's climate, more climate focus on the LNG industry and exports as well. So that's something that needs to be taken into account. But in any event, as I mentioned, the long-term Korean energy focus has to be on decoupling from fossil fuels in aggregate, and policymakers have known that for a long time. But I think there's renewed vigour, renewed energy behind that. So in the paper, I kind of call this concept green security, and that's deliberate reference to the sort of green growth paradigm that's been popular in Korea for a number of years that aim to couple growth and decarbonisation, and now we're talking about coupling energy security and decarbonisation. So the current government has backed up some of the substantial commitments that the Moon administration made under the Green New Deal, and that includes significant support for hydrogen and phase out of coal by mid-century. But it's changed tack. The Yoon government's changed tack in other areas, particularly in the roles of nuclear and renewables. So there's still plans for renewables to provide about 30% of electricity by 2030, but that's a downgrade from 34%. Nuclear's share expected to rise to 32% in 2030, up from 26.5% currently, which is already very high compared to a global average of about 10%. And that reverses policies for a total nuclear phase-out by mid-century as well. So there are estimates, these policies can reduce fossil fuel imports from 80 to 60% of consumption by 2030, but I can foresee a real uphill battle in this sense. There's a really strong path dependency on fossil fuel intensive economic development in Korea. And some of the choices on the decarbonisation pathway are pretty idiosyncratic, I would say, compared to the broad sort of global consensus, which tends to favour a lot more renewables. So the downgrading of renewables is idiosyncratic in that sense, and I think also the really prominent role that hydrogen plays in Korea's decarbonisation pathway is somewhat idiosyncratic as well. Obviously shared with Japan and a few other countries, but it doesn't figure to the extent in other states' plans. I would acknowledge in that sense that there are significant difficulties in deploying renewables in Korea, like wind and solar, relative to a lot of other places in the world on a cost-competitive basis and managing challenges. But I think some of those challenges might be overstated. And hydrogen and nuclear also face a lot of these similar challenges around costliness and social licence challenges. So, I'd note also that in terms of interdependencies, that Korea will need trade partners for hydrogen and for uranium fuel for nuclear as well, so creates complications still, not nearly as intense as those for fossil fuels, but they persist. on the energy security front, I'd close by saying that Seoul's success in diversifying its energy mix, what that looks like, will have a very large bearing on its future economic composition and vice versa to some extent. So, global consumers and policies like carbon border adjustments are starting to favour cleaner trade. You've already seen, the Korean steel giant POSCO is already suggesting it may shift some of its significant energy-intensive production offshore if it's unable to successfully decarbonise domestic production. Already investing in a green iron plant in my home country of Australia for those purposes as well, as a way to decarbonise its steel operations. So that leads into the critical minerals side of things. I think that the rising importance of these critical minerals, is testament to the fact that there's always going to be some form of resource dependencies for a country like Korea to worry about, even if you can decouple from fossil fuels. Critical minerals are in huge demand across a number of really important sectors to Korea's economic model. Divisions of companies like LG and SK and Samsung, they've got about a quarter of the global EV battery market, which is second only to China, so absolutely massive. There's also, so that requires a lot of lithium. It requires a lot of cobalt, nickel, manganese, graphite, variety of other mineral inputs. Korea is also a leading semiconductor manufacturer, and it's growing in importance as a developer of defence technology, advanced weapon systems, which need rare earths and need a variety of other critical minerals as well. And unfortunately, it's again dependent on imports for critical minerals. Resource scarcity is again a problem there. So I think the figure is about 95% of current demand met by imports for critical minerals. And concerningly, the geographic concentration of that trade is even more concerning than it is for something like oil. So China dominates, as I'm sure we all know. The critical mineral space provides about 80% of total processed inputs to the Korean economy. China dominates in the processing stage of critical minerals. Upstream extraction is a bit more diverse. China's also quite dominant in manufacturing as well that uses critical minerals. So I think, the Korean concerns here about inadvertent disruption of trade, but also deliberate weaponization, perhaps. There's the famous case we know of the Chinese-Japanese rare earth dispute 2010. There's also been, as you mentioned, curbs mooted prospective curbs on gallium, germanium, graphite this year. And Korea obviously also has some direct experience of Chinese economic coercion following the deployment of the Terminal High Altitude Area Defence Weapon System 2016. So very concerning in that sense. But I think I would describe the policy to date something of, to use this phrase that's popular at the moment, de-risking, not decoupling to some extent. So the goal under the current administration is to reduce dependence on Chinese imports to meeting 50% of demand by 2030. I mentioned it's currently at 80%. It's pretty sizable, but still recognising that it's difficult to get lower at this point in time, really difficult breaking Chinese stranglehold. But at the same time, I think it's important to note that the ability to manage critical minerals insecurities is greater than it is, I think, for fossil fuel based interdependencies. There's always going to be that condition of the lowest cost reserves of oil being located in the Middle East in perpetuity, whereas the intervention in the critical mineral space is more policy-based. Long-term policy solutions can actually help to reduce some of these dependencies and vulnerabilities, working with partners as well. So there's a list of 33 minerals that were released this year. They're eligible for policy support by the Korean government. There's 10 that receive greater prioritisation. Not a surprise that they include the key battery minerals I mentioned earlier: lithium, nickel, cobalt, manganese, graphite, and another 5 are rare earth elements that are also incredibly insecure because of Chinese control and critical to things like energy transition applications, weapon systems, and other applications. So there's a couple of different policy responses that Korea's already put in place in that sense. Some of those are domestic. They're things like early warning systems for supply chain risks, increasing stockpiles from 44 days to 100 days of demand. There's also a renewed focus on recycling, on EV and battery recycling. And that's one of the key things I think that distinguishes critical minerals security from fossil fuel-based security, that possibility for recycling. It's not just fuel that's used and then gone. You can actually reduce your dependence on imports because of that, but because of that recycling potential. But again, most success is going to happen through expansion and diversification of international supply chains. That remains absolutely critical in this space. And I think that that's an area where that resource diplomacy is really unavoidable as well. There are problems, there are challenges around it, but it's not something that can be avoided. And I think that the Moon government already realised that it created the Korea Mine Rehabilitation Minerals Resource Corporation, KOMIR, August 2021. The current administration has built on that, improved the ability of agencies like these to issue loans, guarantees, and insurance to Korean companies investing in new capacity. There's a overseas development tax credit reintroduced that was axed in 2012. A number of strategic bilateral partnerships with governments in resource-rich countries, generally seeking to leverage their public and private finance as well, their efforts that are ongoing. Korea's also joined up to multilateral or minilateral groups like the US-led Mineral Security Partnership. That's very important from the sense as well that these things can't happen necessarily on a bilateral level. The value chains, supply chains involved in producing technologies like EVs, batteries are very complicated. There's different comparative advantages in different countries around who will perform what role. There's obviously different allocations of geological wealth as well. So the more countries you can get involved in this process, the better. But one thing, I suppose, on the negative side or on the challenges side is that a lot of these critical minerals policies, Korean critical minerals policies, still seem to place most of the emphasis on supply chain diversification on private industry. So the overseas public investment that we're seeing seems to be mostly limited to de-risking upstream investment, whereas support for processing, where I've mentioned diversification is most critical, seems to still be largely domestically focused. So there's a risk, I suppose, that these efforts won't go far enough. And in the paper, I highlight the comparison with Japan's approach to rare earth security in particular. That seems to have been a broadly agreeable and successful process from the Japanese perspective, starting with the most prominent effort in that sense was the joint venture between a Japanese trading company, Sojitz Corporation, and the Japanese Organization for Metals and Energy Security, JOGMEC. Committed $250 million to an Australian rare earth company, Lynas, and its Malaysian processing facilities back in 2011. Has continued that relationship to this day. New investment in 2022 again, so it seems to be broadly agreeable and has a bit more intense kind of investment across the supply chain, more public investment as well, relative to the Korean example, from my perspective anyway. And again, a second risk I would highlight is the nature of the partnerships that Seoul and Korean businesses are pursuing on critical minerals policies. So the Indo-Pacific Strategy I mentioned had a focus on like-minded partners, but a lot of the government-to-government and business-to-business partnerships seem to be a bit more fluid. There's not really the kind of focus on like-mindedness from my perspective. Generally, we wouldn't see that as a problem, and it seems to be aligned with that focus on free trade, that defence of free trade, as I said. But we're in a really increasingly geoeconomically, geostrategically contested, fragmented world, and so that's going to throw up a few challenges. It already is, I think. And a key example of that I see is the Korean involvement in US and Indonesian critical minerals value chains at the moment. So Korean businesses are have been the largest foreign investors in the US battery factories following the Inflation Reduction Act package. Korean firms are also investing heavily in Indonesian battery value chains, starting from the mineral stage onwards. And both of those efforts, to some extent, respond to Washington and Jakarta prioritising their own domestic interests rather than engaging in free trade. So manufacturers in the US need to be sourcing their minerals from that are either produced or processed in the US or a free trade agreement partner. to access the full benefits of the IRA. Firms operating in Indonesia are partially doing so because Indonesia has a ban on critical minerals exports in unprocessed forms, nickel most prominently. So in that World Economic Forum speech of Yoon's that I mentioned earlier, he spoke of the need to expand our small bloc to form a larger bloc in terms of defending free trade. But some of those efforts seem to have been unsuccessful so far. So I know that there's possibility this might be resolved, but there's been challenges getting the US on board with extending IRA subsidies to countries like Indonesia. And that would help to stitch together Korean companies' involvement across value chains. And also I think that the fact that Korean firms are starting to seem to be increasingly attracted to making international over domestic investments in critical minerals also rings a few alarm bells potentially from the Korean mindset. So Seoul's long been a standard bearer for successful industrial policy, but it's increasingly having to contend with other states closing off access to resources or consumer markets to serve their own economic goals. So this is a big challenge from my perspective. And it generally adds to what I see on the energy security and critical minerals side of things as something of an inflection point around future resources security policy between pursuing the business as usual approach, favouring continuity and accepting more disruption, needing to make more radical change. I think that the policy temptation will continue to be in both critical minerals and energy security, will focus on policies that will allow the continuation of that resource and import-dependent economic development model, but it'll be more difficult to achieve because of this intense disruption and interlinked issues that we're seeing. And I think climate change in particular is a permanent issue. The energy transition is a permanent issue we need to be focusing on. So there's going to be more pressure to achieve what I call green security and to deliver critical mineral security to meet new economic priorities. But the alternative that I can see is that Korea and Korean policymakers, businesses will need to accept something of an enforced reduction in that old model of domestic resources intensity as perhaps industry moves offshore to other locations.
Well, thank you, James. And actually,
sorry, maybe we went a bit over time.
Oh, no, that's fine. I'd rather you sort of flesh all this out. And I think, some of the things I want to ask you before we go to the floor, and you kind of really sort of teed some of this up because, I think you're right. I mean, we often in the U.S. have this political debate about, climate change and the transition to renewables and other things. But in some ways, the rest of the world is going to move on with or without the United States. And sort of Korea, I guess, is in a similar position. One thing I like to point out to some people is that, Apple has set a policy that all of its suppliers have to be carbon neutral by 2030. And South Korea is, lagging in this area, and that impacts, Samsung and SK Hynix. And so that then means you have a situation to where Samsung, SK Hynix can still meet Apple's requirements, but they just have to meet it from their plants outside of South Korea, which then has clear impact on industrial policy in South Korea.
Exactly.
So in some ways, you're kind of forced, into these situations. And I think what I really like about your paper is that, because I don't know, I think intuitively we all know this, but we don't talk about it this way, but that, when we think about the future through the energy transition, we're not going to be talking about petroleum anymore, but there are still going to be risks and challenges for minerals in terms of sourcing. And that'll change because, as you know, you can recycle. So you won't necessarily have to be as dependent on other countries in the sense that you have to have it constantly flowing through, because you could have disruptions and probably get through and adapt. But it's going to be a different world, and we'll be talking about different partners and things. But so in that context, I think the first thing I want to ask you is, you noted early on, Korea's been reluctant to change its model, both in terms of industry and in terms of energy sourcing. But you ended with this idea that, it's kind of going to be forced to. But so what are some of the risks, I think, do you see for South Korea if it continues to remain reluctant rather than sort of embracing that transition? Yeah,
well, I think that as we have discussed, some of the choices, some of the risks might be resolved by others, and that's a risk that if policymakers don't take the decisions that work in their own favour, then the choices that are imposed on them on the Korean economy might not be optimum in some senses. I study Indo-Pacific energy relatively exclusively, but obviously are quite aware of what is happening elsewhere in the world. And, the big trend in Europe in particular in the wake of the Russian war in Ukraine seems to be a realization of that those two things of energy security and decarbonisation going hand in hand. To some extent, I'm perplexed that we haven't seen as much momentum behind that in countries that are far more intensely dependent on imports, like Korea or Japan as well. There has been a lot of rhetoric around it, but maybe not so much action, because why would you not want to actually decrease your reliance on volatile fossil fuels, even working with like-minded partners? I mentioned there's some challenges there as well that might be faced with countries like Australia and the US, because they need to decarbonise as well, and they have emissions that are generated by their export projects in country as well. But even if you're dealing exclusively with like-minded countries, if you're still working in global energy markets, you're still exposed to international dynamics, etc. The only way you can actually do that is by decoupling or reducing your exposure to fossil fuels in aggregate. So I think that's a big risk that needs to be managed. The longer the time frame, the longer the time horizon we stretch out to, the more pressure there will be on countries that are climate laggards as well, obviously, and don't decarbonise. Political pressure, but also economic pressure as well. Some of those policies like trade, like carbon border adjustments, as I mentioned, consumer preferences turning against you, needing to offshore a lot of activity. These are a lot of risks that I would see.
Along those lines, because you had mentioned, steel production and the investments in Australia and everything. It's not just because I think we often see the Europeans as the ones pushing this forward, but you have the ongoing steel and aluminum talks between the US and the EU, which could then put pressure on both Korean and Japanese steel industries to much more quickly decarbonize to be competitive in those markets as well.
Yeah, I think there'll be kind of a domino effect in these sorts of things. Once it starts to be imposed on one rather large market like the EU and trade starts to be impacted by that, there will be others. Australia's even starting to talk about this sort of thing as well. And we don't even have carbon pricing in place. So generally it would seem to be that you would do that first in jurisdictions that do have that. But we're starting to move further down into the ideas of maybe we will use our iron ore resources to do domestic refining production, maybe move further into green iron, green steel, and then we don't want to be unfairly disadvantaged because of that. So we will start to look at trade policy about how we manage some of those tensions. So I think we'll start to see a lot more momentum behind that as one or two countries or blocks start to introduce these policies. It'll take off pretty quickly. Those who aren't moving with the pace of things will get left behind and face some pretty significant challenges.
So one thing I'd be curious to get your thoughts on is, you talked about the dependence on the Middle East for petroleum, and you noted how now that the U.S. exports crude oil, you've seen some come from the United States. Australia has been a partner as well in this. Why has Korea been reluctant to sort of perhaps move further away from the Middle East and its own instability, or is this just a structural problem in energy markets to where Korea's kind of done what it can, but it's really hard to really diversify away from the Middle East for them?
So I think I would have recourse to the domestic reliance on that economic model that places large dependence on oil and other imported energy forms and imported fossil fuels. Because if you could make that easy choice to get away from Middle East and oil, you would. But as I said, it is the structural advantage of Middle Eastern oil, having the most economically efficiently developed reserves. But I think you could ask that same question as well around the Europeans. Why did you not diversify away from Russia ahead of these things only become really clear in times of crises? I think, and then in hindsight you can say, well, that's a completely foolish decision. But the justification at the time was, well, it is a matter of convenience. There's no cheaper gas that we can source than Russian pipeline gas, oil, coal, etc. So until it becomes a massive problem like that, they're happy to maintain this fragile balance, and Korea's historically done that, maintain this really fragile balance and been able to get through mostly. But that fragile bedrock remains and may be exposed again in future.
Yeah, and I guess in the European case, you could, even though it's fascinating, you start looking back and you hear all the times where you have U.S. administrations saying, don't buy this from Russia and everything, and they did it anyways. But at least in their case, you could say it literally was their neighbor to where, the Middle East and Korea are not, contiguous and everything. So it's sort of an interesting dynamic. So I want to move a little bit now to sort of like the mineral sides as well. And, we talked about how China's put in place the restrictions on germanium, graphite, and gallium. You know, at the moment, there are no indications that China is going to try to restrict these. I mean, you know, I think in the first month of some of the initial restrictions, there were no exports, but apparently China's been issuing licenses, and so it looks like that will change. But what steps, you know, you've talked about Korea trying to reduce from 80 to 30%, you know, over the next
50%,
years.
yeah.
But what can Korea do to really kind of reduce this vulnerability? And is that actually, given Japan's experience, how long it took them to get to where they are now, is that really a realistic goal?
So yeah, I think from the Chinese perspective, it does maybe seem to be something just like a shot across the bow at this point in time, but it also potentially counterproductive that, you know, the 2010 rare earth dispute and a lot of other, you know, the world awakening to China's intense control of rare earths has eventually helped to reduce dependencies. I think there was something like 80% of upstream rare earths activity in China at one point in time, and we're maybe down to 60% or something like that. So diversification has worked. It takes time. There's no getting away from that. I don't think that it has to be this long-term process of just developing alternative supply chains, new minerals processing, new minerals provinces, minerals processing in a variety of different locations around the world. I think the gallium and germanium things are quite interesting in the sense that you would say that the end goal for any minerals, any mineral is to get to somewhere where it functions like an international commodity it's freely traded in international markets, and there's a lot of transparency. But those gallium and germanium are very, very small, very niche minerals used in highly strategic applications. It's difficult to envisage where we might get to that highly traded sort of environment. There needs to be a focus on things like stockpiling, a lot more focus on some of those niche minerals, I think. And then from that perspective, to some extent, every country in the critical mineral space has this critical mineral strategy, but you maybe need one for each individual mineral, tailored to their specific needs, which is very complex, obviously. Alternative chemistries as well is obviously a big thing as well, like finding ways to avoid these things will be necessary. There seems to be already, from what I've seen, indications that a lot of countries that are responding to the gallium and germanium side of things have sufficient stockpiling and technologies in store as well. So maybe it won't be that significant, and we haven't actually seen a lot of impact at this point in time. But yeah, from my perspective, the long-term goal has to remain that supply chain diversification. But there are a lot of things, as I said, you can do in terms of stockpiling and also alternative uses. You know, this is another area that I think lends critical minerals policy to policy interventions being more successful than they are in the energy security side of things. To some extent, you have to always remain reliant on the Middle East, where you don't have to remain reliant on China, because most of China's success is through the policy realm. So if you can do that yourself, then you can get around that.
Though it does raise an interesting question because, you know, and you mentioned this in your talking in the paper, but I mean, part of this is governments can set policies, but this is ultimately driven by the private sector. And so if the private sector companies don't take and, you know, make the investments or make the switches, if they decide that their supply chains are better served keeping this, it makes it hard from a national level to take and really diversify away from China or the Middle East, you know.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I think, you know, we have to have realistic expectations around what can be achieved. No, this is the whole kind of de-risking, not decoupling kind of approach. The level of intensity of Chinese involvement in supply chains is so great that we won't be able to reduce it particularly easily. And private industry in a lot of countries are not really buying into the geopolitical side of things. They will just chase the highest returns. They'll chase where investment is coming from, where trade is coming from. I know this from extensive experience in Australia, which has incredibly high involvement of Chinese companies in our supply chains. We're starting to buy into the sort of friendshoring era. We're an FTA partner of the US, for example, so local miners are very excited about the FTA requirements for electric vehicle tax credits in the US. And we've already seen a bit more investment, I think, already into Australia because of that, from American companies or companies who want to be eligible for those. But at the same time, it's going to be a quite slow pace, and I think that generally it's not going to be that we are going to preclude Chinese investment. It's going to be at the margins. It's going to be additional investment basically coming from other countries like the US, like these trusted countries, I should say.
Yeah, and I think, you know, you talk about the difference between decoupling and de-risking. I mean, decoupling was never a realistic option. It probably wasn't even a financially wise one. But there is a logic to making sure that, basically setting aside even geopolitics, that, if there is some kind of natural disaster in China or something, that, you're just not suddenly cut off, like we saw in the pandemic with a lot of things, that you have places you can resource from and change your supply chains too. But I think this leads into one of the other things I wanted to ask you about, which is that, this idea of like-minded partners. And, we've just mentioned, you can't cut China out. And in terms of, actually having, security over energy or security over your raw material sources, is, given the distribution of where just some of the countries where the mines for like most of the resources like cobalt and everything in the Democratic Republic of Congo, a lot of the world's nickel is in, I think, Indonesia and Russia. So Indonesia is maybe a like-minded partner, but Russia clearly we have concerns with now. So is the like-minded concept the best one in terms of trying to really secure your access to these resources, or is there some other framework we should be using?
Yeah, it's really difficult because you're basically, to some extent, looking to unwind globalization and free trade to that extent. So even if you look at the Indonesian example, for example, I mentioned that there are challenges in terms of integrating Indonesia into something like the IRA. So most investment in Indonesia is from China. So if you're starting to extend US taxpayer-funded benefits to Indonesian minerals, are you opening a backdoor to subsidization of Chinese operations? In Australia, for example, the nickel mining industry is actually not particularly keen on Indonesian nickel having access to the IRA because they are a great rival and trading on creating a sort of green image and maybe looking to attract a green premium for nickel in batteries from Australia, because so much of Indonesian nickel is coal-fired, is powered by coal fire. There's a lot of accusations of corruption and poor labour standards, etc. as well. So it's incredibly complicated because we're trying to put the genie back in the bottle to some extent in terms of globalization. So that kind of focus on like-mindedness is very difficult to achieve. But I think it does have some value in the sense of if we're talking about responding to things like the war in Ukraine, Russian war in Ukraine. Absolutely, it didn't make sense for European countries or others to be so dependent on an authoritarian producer like that. It doesn't make sense also to be so dependent on Middle Eastern producers who are known to, have been accused of manipulating energy flows to balance their own budgets and other in past occasions for coercive measures as well. Similar with China. I know from my own experience in Australia of Chinese economic coercion. We've had a lot of that in the past couple of years. Korea has similar experiences. So it completely makes sense to focus on trusted partners, like-minded partners. I think, as I said, the focus potentially is more not on actually unwinding anything that's currently in place, but future expansion, and particularly in the energy transition space, because we're talking about expanding an economic pie. We're not talking about actually substitution. This is a big growth area. So it makes sense that everyone would try to have some sort of equitable share of the EV market, the battery market, or new technologies, things like hydrogen, nuclear, revival perhaps as well. So I think that's where it has value, and it makes sense for countries to focus on it. But it's not valuable to say that this is a viable alternative to depoliticized, globalized trade in that sense.
Yeah. So I have just one more question before we turn to the audience. So I just want to remind anybody watching online, if you have a question, to please take it, put it into the YouTube chat. But so, we often talk about the costs of transition, renewables, at one point, solar was more expensive than it is, and wind, or whether in the case of Korea, it has the right sort of natural characteristics in terms of sunlight and wind to take and do this and everything. And so, each country has to have its own mix of, new technologies. But, I guess the question I'd have is, so maybe rather than talking about the costs, are there economic benefits from Korea perhaps doing more of a transition to, clean energy, even if it's not necessarily the clean energy that maybe you would do in Australia or somewhere else?
Sure. Well, I think, I fully acknowledge that there are, we tend to talk, I suppose, in the energy transition sense, in in a global sense that renewables are cheaper than fossil fuel alternatives, but that's not necessarily true in every geographic location around the world. There are a lot of national challenges or individual challenges around the deployment of certain technologies, and in an era of high inflation as well, because clean energy tends to be more capital intensive. We're starting to see costs rising around these sorts of things as well. So that whole advantage of just high upfront costs and then low ongoing costs, so low operating costs, doesn't hold as much either. So there are a lot of challenges. But there's a lot of assessments out there as well that I think that in countries that do claim that it's very difficult to deploy renewables, that it's not as difficult as it does appear to be when you get down to it. There is a lot of land availability. I cite a key study in the report that shows that actually Korea does have enough uncontested land, so that's land not subject to other competing uses, to deploy far in advance of what it currently generates from fossil fuels in solar and wind, and at a levelized cost of electricity lower than current gas generation. So I do think that potentially, and you see this in like IPCC reports as well, that the major challenge we see now tends to be political and social to the energy transition around a lot of this stuff as well. So it's not so much the economics, or it's not the technological or technical limitations. It seems to be socio-political barriers. So getting past that is part of the challenge. I think, long term, if you can make those investments, then obviously you will enjoy more economic benefits and not have to be constantly paying for expensive imported fossil fuels, particularly if you're going to be regularly experiencing shocks like we have seen in the past couple of years. Maybe it will be a while before we have another one of those, but they will be dramatic, they'll continue. So if you can get away from that, obviously it's to your advantage. I think there's, potentially... So one of the great success stories, as I mentioned, from Korea and the energy transition seems to be in the manufacturing space. So they Korean companies are already excelling in terms of EVs and battery production, but they're not necessarily deploying them domestically as well. But that could be an advantage as well in terms of if there's more focus on that on the domestic market. That will help to achieve economies of scale and lower costs as well around their own production, and then perhaps boost their exports as well. So it's a symbiotic relationship, the way that China has seen that. Maybe there's more opportunity to realise that as well. Korea's been really focused on the hydrogen side of things. Unfortunately, there was a lot more hype around hydrogen a few years ago than there currently is as well. So I'm not really sure that the advantages in terms of fuel cell vehicle manufacturing is going to be realised to the same extent. Maybe there should be more focus on domestic deployment of EVs and batteries and that sort of thing, and building up the grid as well, and grid storage batteries as well. That could be another key area of economic strength.
Yeah, no, I think one of the things that's interesting about this too is, I think this was a New York Times article, is talking about if you look at Ukraine into the war, they've actually tried to start deploying more wind and solar because it's harder for the Russians to take out. It's more dispersed, and rather than like one plant.
Yeah.
All right. I'd like to take a turn to the audience now. Jane, do you have
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for an excellent presentation, James, and also a really rich discussion, Troy. I do have a few questions related to critical minerals supply chain. I'm sorry, my name is Jane Nakano with CSI's Energy Security and Climate Change Program. So I do have several questions regarding critical minerals strategy by Korea, and then one on hydrogen, if I may, but I'm going to try to be quick. So from my in my view, it is essential to have Korea as really close partner as the United States tries to build out this diversified, secure critical minerals and also clean energy supply chains. Right. For example, China accounts for like 75% of the cathode material supply chains, while Korea accounts for half of the remainder. But as James, you mentioned as well, under the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, clean vehicle tax credit, we're looking to I guess we're waiting for the Treasury Department's guidance as to the degree of China dependence that country, the mineral contents could have, and also the EV battery components could have. So in that sense, I'm curious to hear what are the type of sort of reactions, but then also some of the plans that the Korean stakeholders may have as they sort of, they try to brace for this, the, I guess, U.S.-China clean energy rivalry going to sort of a next gear potentially if the Treasury guidance is a very strict one. So that's my first question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's already been some Korean response to the IRA. There's been an increase in support to domestic industry that was initially, that we saw around the world as well. It seems to be that, there's been a lot of lobbying as well, obviously, around Washington, around diversifying some of these requirements. I mentioned that the Koreans are keen to see Indonesia, and I think a few other kind of countries have access to the benefits through the IRA. If the incredibly strict restrictions come in, there's a bit of kind of conjecture there, I guess, to some extent. But from my perspective, what I see from Korea already, Korean industry and Korean government is a pretty fluid sort of strategy as well, that they are, to the extent that is possible, trying to integrate into these US value chains, but also looking elsewhere, like into Indonesia, Southeast Asia, spreading that risk, I guess, and spreading that and diversifying elsewhere as well. There's a real focus on Australia as well, working with South Korea. South Korea is considered a very critical partner in critical minerals value chains in Australia as well, because of that dual, I guess, focus on like-mindedness and also their existing strength, particularly at the manufacturing stage as well. So I think, there would be just a spread of diversification and elsewhere, and looking, to spread the risk as much as possible and mitigate that.
Andy, do you have anything online or? Okay.
Jane has a couple more questions.
Yeah, I do have a couple more questions.
Yeah.
Okay. No, that was great. Thanks. And so I also wanted to ask you about more of a domestic politics as it regards to critical minerals. So within the United States, I think there is a bipartisan recognition that the critical mineral supply chain vulnerabilities is something that the government needs to, take leadership in addressing. But I think when it comes to specific approaches and tools, maybe there's a party difference. So within Korea, I was curious whether there is some variation of the ways that they look at the current government's critical mineral strategy, and if that's something that may be sustained, for some time to come. So that's my.
So for this project, I was mainly, I suppose, focused on the current administration's approach to critical minerals, but did kind of dig back into, the evolution of policies under previous government. Didn't really focus, I suppose, so much on the domestic side of things. So I have a little bit of challenge in commenting on that. I think that, from my perspective, what I found was that these were what the current government has decisions that have taken seems to be, as I said, logical responses to exigent circumstances. So reviving the ability of state agencies and public support for private industry to invest abroad and to build out supply chains both domestically and internationally, and to build up some of those domestic resilience measures like stockpiling and recycling. I'm not, long term, I'm not particularly sure, and I have to confess I'm not really a Korean domestic policy expert. Maybe Troy, you have something to offer on this space in particular. I did tend to see when I was doing the research for this paper, there's a bit of a concern, I guess, around that kind of trend that I mentioned around offshoring, because of the challenges in actually realizing implementing Korean industrial policy in this new, really contested environment. That, as I said, Korean companies seem to be looking to invest abroad in critical minerals value chains because of challenges that they might be experiencing, or because of generally in response to more strident industrial policy from other countries, basically. So I did start to see a little bit of concern around that, but I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
This is a really good question.
Yeah.
I haven't seen anything specific on critical minerals, but I was thinking back through, there is a tendency in Korea to, when you have a transition from administrations, to want to just sort of push aside your predecessors' policies and everything. But Yoon was somewhat different in that he largely kept the moon policies on hydrogen, as you noted. The supply chain efforts that Moon had put in place sort of at the end of his administration, they've more built on rather than really tried to change. So I'd have to look at critical minerals specifically, but it seems like, at least in terms of from administration to administration, there's been some coherence recently here. But I can tell you on the subsidy side, that's probably where you'd see some differences. There was a lot of pushback, I think, by the DP, at least on the semiconductor side, on, why should we be funneling a bunch of money into these highly successful companies who can, do a lot of this investment on their own? So critical minerals might be slightly different, but, that's sort of not directly, but sort of indirectly trying to get it where maybe they're at.
Yeah, I mean, I think I hinted at that evolution from what I saw as there being under probably the early stages of the Moon government and preceding governments, there seemed to be a turn against what I called, and what is commonly called resource diplomacy abroad. Because of some of those risks, there tended to be more of a hands-off approach to in public investment because of the risks of debt accumulation and like some of those other problems like corruption. But now there seems to be more of a consensus around a need for intervention, state intervention, including abroad in critical minerals value chains. That seems to be, from my perspective, a current that goes through the end of the Moon government into the Yoon government, and potentially, I think the trend lines seem to support that will continue as well.
Yeah, I mean, some of this was even changed from conservative to conservative government because a lot of the resource investment was done under Emo Bach, but a lot of those had either had poor returns or had failed, and so it was the Park Geun-hye administration that was sort of pulling back on that. So sometimes it's even intra-party changes.
Yeah, and as I said as well, that it's unavoidable to some extent that this needs to happen in the critical mineral space because of just the lack of capacity that's out there, the lack of investment from private industry, and part of that is to do with that immature market development. So there's so much price volatility as well that private industry doesn't necessarily get the signals that they need to invest. So government needs to step in this in a lot of different mineral sectors. It's unavoidable to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, I think even you talked about capacity, and the IEA was something like, I can't remember, like 2030 or 2050, but basically capacity has to increase like fourfold from what we have now.
Yeah, and that's for the broad gamut of critical minerals that go into the energy transition for individual things like, and that includes things like copper and nickel, which are already mass market production, but things like lithium, it's higher still. It's maybe in the double digits in terms of what needs to happen.
Yeah. Okay, Sang.
All right, so for the interest of time, I'm just going to pick one question online. So could you expand on the opportunities of recycling, things like e-waste as a source of critical minerals and components?
Yeah, so I think this is really, as I said, it's really important distinction between a minerals-based energy system and a fuel-based energy system. There is various estimates out there by companies like Benchmark Minerals, which is one of the kind of leading information services in the critical mineral space, that recycling, I think, will start to play a really important role maybe in a decade's time or a bit more than that. The technologies for that are pretty immature at this point in time, but traditionally metals are the most recyclable materials we have on Earth. So this is a fundamental difference in the energy system of the future, that we will actually be able to use a lot more of the stuff we've already used rather than having the constant demand for new inputs to our energy systems. And that will become potentially a new important revenue stream, a new industry for a lot of companies and countries around the world as well.
All right. Jane, if you want, real quick. James, you have 30 seconds.
Okay, no problem. So much. Well, James, since you're in Washington, I'd like to ask more of a U.S., well, not I guess U.S. related question. So as far as the hydrogen goes, in the potential sort of a trade scenario, what is the potential role that the U.S. hydrogen supply may play in Korea's hydrogen adoption? Or maybe from the Korea's perspective, is there sort of interest in, investing in hydrogen capacity or different types of hydrogen related projects within the United States, given huge subsidies under the Inflation Reduction Act?
Yeah, that's really an apt question for an Australian as well, because Australia has vast kind of hydrogen export ambitions as well, and a lot of people in the hydrogen space were quite concerned about the IRA and the massive subsidies that were on offer there as well. But the conversation in Australia as well has shifted a lot to maybe because of the cost and technical difficulties of actually shipping hydrogen molecules or ammonia even, that there will be some sort of reorganisation of supply chains that we will actually be using that domestically and maybe to decarbonise industrial production, things like steel and other metals, rather than kind of being trade in hydrogen. I think that we're in a really early stage around the viability of trade in hydrogen still. But my perspective was, because I've dug a lot into kind of hydrogen over the years as well, that I'm generally thinking that that's the pathway, that producing hydrogen, using it locally and exporting the end product is kind of more viable at this point in time. I think there has been a bit more, I haven't really studied it that closely, but I think there has been a bit of Korean and Japanese investment in the US hydrogen sector post-IRA. That's kind of the big threat that I see from Australia's perspective as well, that actually like the capital gets diverted here as well, that rather than actually being great rivals. I think we have this kind of path dependency. We have to think about the way that the old economic energy systems worked. We're going to be rivals in exporting molecules, but that maybe it's going to be fundamentally different in some ways.
Well, James, thank you. It has been a really great conversation. This is a very important topic, I think, because, sort of as you noted, everything begins with the raw materials. You have to be either energy or the minerals themselves. And so, for Korea, but as James pointed out, even for the United States and others, this is going to be an important issue going forward. And so I really appreciate you coming. You were saying it was 30 hours to basically get here, so coming from Australia, talking about this today and everything. And so I would encourage everyone, as I mentioned, James's paper will come out hopefully before the end of this year, as will the rest of the volume, Korea Policy Looking at Economic Security. And there's a lot of papers, I've read the initial drafts, that I would commend everyone looking at how the United States views economic security, Japan, South Korea, China, also things like semiconductors, which my colleague Clint hosted a discussion on last week. So I encourage everybody to look at that. And once again, James, thank you, really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.